Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Mohammed became a driver for Uber and Lyft about 9 years ago. He'd been a yellow cab driver in New York City for a decade before that, but switched to the apps in part because they offered him more control over his schedule.
You are very free, very flexible to have the job, to do whatever you want.
Mohammed likes working mornings.
I wake up 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock after the early prayer. Then I keep working until 1, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock.
Nearly every day for the past 9 years, that was Mohammed's schedule. Wake up, pray, drive. He'd open the Uber app on his phone, press the big go button that signals he's ready for passengers, and start picking people up around the city. Until this summer.
In August, he clicks go and nothing happens. And instead, he sees a message that you aren't able to go online and another message that says go to a busy area to go online.
Natalie Lung is a tech reporter for Bloomberg, and she says that when Mohammed tried to log into Lyft that day, he was locked out too. Over the next few weeks, Mohammed kept getting locked out of both apps again and again, and he sent Natalie voice notes from the road, chronicling his experience.
Sometimes many days when I start work, it's locked out, both of them. That means tell you go back home, go back to sleep, or wait in the car until we open the app for you.
The lockouts were disruptive and frustrating. Mohammed couldn't predict when he'd be able to work.
When you are coming out of your bed and you take a shower and you are ready to work, and they tell you, no, you're not going to work now. Before the lockouts, you are very free, very flexible to have the job. But now, after lockout, you are very controlled.
Natalie and her colleagues discovered that over the course of the summer, lockouts were affecting thousands of drivers like Mohammed all over the city. It was part of an intentional strategy by Uber and Lyft to cut down on the time drivers spend without passengers in the car and the amount of money these companies would have to spend next year to compensate them.
The issue here is a classic demand and supply problem. Uber and Lyft have onboarded too many drivers. So in an attempt to fix that supply issue, to balance it, they are locking drivers out.
Today on the show, an investigation into Uber and Lyft's summer of lockouts, what the company's strategy cost drivers and customers, and what it says about the future of regulating the gig economy. This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. The story of Uber and Lyft's 2024 summer of lockouts actually starts way back in 2018, when New York City passed a law establishing a minimum wage for rideshare app drivers, the first of its kind in the U.S. Bloomberg tech reporter Natalie Lung told me it was an extra complicated rule for the city's Taxi and Limousine Commission to design because of the way ride-hail drivers work. The commission, called the TLC for short, wanted to find a way to make sure drivers were compensated fairly for all their working hours, including the time they spent on the job waiting for riders.
The TLC commissioned 2 economists to study how to implement that rule effectively.
The economists found that drivers weren't making enough each hour through fares alone. Uber and Lyft would have to step in to compensate drivers for the time they spent working without passengers in the car. But how much of the driver's time should be paid for by passengers, and how much should be covered by the companies? To find the sweet spot, economists developed a formula.
The economists came up with the model where drivers would not only be compensated for per mile and per minute, but there will also be a component or a multiplier called the utilization rate, which measures how busy drivers are and would compensate drivers when they don't have a passenger in their car.
A utilization rate. It basically measures how much of an Uber or Lyft driver's on time is spent with an actual passenger in the car versus how much is spent driving around waiting for a passenger. Because it would be too complicated to calculate a different utilization rate for every driver every day, the city sets an industry-wide standard rate each year based on data from all the drivers in the city. When the minimum wage law came into effect in 2019, that utilization rate was set at 58. That meant out of every 100 minutes on the job, the average Uber or Lyft driver in New York City spent about 58 minutes with passengers.
And the other 42 minutes are on the road going to a passenger or waiting for ride requests.
Those 42 minutes, idle time not covered by passenger fares, are what Uber and Lyft are on the hook for. And Natalie says companies want that idle number to be as low as possible, and that utilization rate, the efficiency rate, to stay as high as possible. Because
the higher the utilization rate, the company's out-of-pocket pay will be lower. And conversely, if the utilization rate is lower, meaning drivers are waiting around more, the companies will have to pay more out of pocket to compensate for that idle time.
The idea was that this utilization rate would be refreshed every year by the TLC, based on updated statistics submitted by the rideshare companies.
But then the pandemic happened in 2020, and that really plummeted rideshare demand, and that caused the TLC to just keep the rate as 58%. And it went on until now.
Until now. Because in the first 2 months of 2024, that utilization rate dropped below 53%. The problem was there were too many drivers on the road and not enough riders. Idle time was increasing. And that was very bad news for Uber and Lyft.
53% is like a floor that is set by the city. If they go below that, they would have to pay more out of pocket next year or whenever the TLC evaluates it again.
So the reason that they're trying to meet this utilization rate, this rate of 53% activity for drivers, is to save themselves money.
Right, and their argument is that they wouldn't want to pass all that cost to riders, and riders would be, scared off by the higher prices, and that would lead to lower demand for the service and less jobs for drivers. So they feel like this is a cycle that they don't want to see.
So to make sure drivers were spending more time driving each hour, to keep that utilization rate from dropping more, and to save themselves tens of millions of dollars in future driver wages, Uber and Lyft did something drastic. This summer, they started locking drivers out of the app. Drivers were outraged. They were being locked out of their livelihoods. Many took to the streets in protest. Bloomberg broke the news about the first Uber lockouts in June. Lyft started locking out drivers shortly thereafter. The companies didn't deny what they were doing. They said they needed to lock some drivers out some of the time because of a mismatch between rider demand and driver supply. But Natalie and her team had a hunch this wasn't the full story. They wanted to know more about just how many drivers were impacted by Uber and Lyft's decision and how much money was on the line for companies. So the reporters started a massive crowdsourcing campaign. Who they heard from and what they found after the break. To understand the impact of the Uber and Lyft lockouts on New York City's ride-hail system, Bloomberg reporter Natalie Lung and her colleagues needed a way to hear from as many drivers as possible.
And so we created this automated WhatsApp tip line to let them send screenshots of lockouts when they encounter them.
They opened the tip line in mid-August, and the response was overwhelming.
By the end of this 3-week collection period, we had close to 900 drivers sending us screenshots of their lockouts.
Wow. And were you surprised by the level of response?
Yeah, we were surprised that so many people responded to us within a short period of time. But at the same time, we understood drivers were really desperate and eager to seek out someone who would listen to their plight.
Armed with more than 5,000 screenshots and after more than 100 interviews, Natalie and her team found that the lockouts were more frequent and more damaging than was previously reported. Uber and Lyft had told them earlier that summer that they were only locking out drivers during low-demand times. But Bloomberg found lockouts were actually happening at almost every hour of the day, even during periods of high demand.
The fact that these lockouts are unpredictable makes them hard to plan out how much they need to earn and how much they need to work. For Mohammed's example, he told me that he has incurred around $2,000 in credit card debt. A lot of them are behind on taxes. Some of them, they're behind on their auto loan payments, insurance payments.
To make up for the lost time, drivers started working more and taking fewer breaks.
They feel like if they took a break and went offline on the app voluntarily, it makes it impossible for them to get online again. And so one driver I spoke to, he would just forego bathroom breaks or lunch breaks and just keep driving so that he could make the most out of his online time.
It was a little ironic. Uber and Lyft have long argued to regulators that drivers are independent contractors, not employees.
A lot of drivers told us that this is completely the opposite of the foundational flexibility that they were promised when they switched over to the platforms. And it makes it complicated because they have unpredictable hours. They cannot work when they want to work.
It was frustrating for riders, too. As Uber and Lyft limited the supply of drivers on the road, prices in some areas rose.
And we found more than 400 instances of drivers being locked out in surge zones. And in about half of those instances, the price for consumers did increase after a lockout. But
for the companies, all this pain for drivers and customers may have been worth it. Because Natalie and her team found that for Uber and Lyft, the lockouts served an important purpose: protecting the company's bottom line. Based on Bloomberg's analysis, by stopping the utilization rate from dipping too low through lockouts, Uber and Lyft would save themselves from having to make millions of dollars in extra minimum wage payments next year.
So our analysis found, using historical data from the first 6 months of the year, even 1% drop in the utilization rate would cause Uber and Lyft tens of millions of dollars.
So just to make sure I'm understanding the impact of these lockouts, from what your reporting shows, companies saved tens of millions of dollars. Drivers worked longer hours, went into thousands of dollars of debt, and customers paid more for rides.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty staggering impact.
Right.
Spokespeople for both Uber and Lyft have pushed back on this calculation, saying that the financial model Bloomberg used doesn't take into account how a lower utilization rate would make the companies pass more costs on to riders, in turn scaring more business away. How did Uber explain why they were doing these lockouts when you asked about them?
So they said it's actually by the rule's design, saying the rule incentivizes companies to increase their utilization rate so that drivers will be kept busier and so that the supply will be managed better. So they say lockouts is actually a feature of the rule, not a bug.
What did Lyft say?
Lyft, in a letter that they sent to the TLC, they said it's also a necessary tool, even though it's a last resort for them, because they noticed that rideshare demand has been weaker than anticipated, even though they already stopped onboarding new drivers last year.
What did you think about those explanations that Uber and Lyft gave?
Obviously, lockouts are a feature that the companies decided to do themselves. Like, the regulator did not force them to do it. There's definitely more that they could have done earlier, or there were other ways that this could have been resolved before resorting to lockouts.
Natalie says the situation in New York City shows how complicated it is to calculate the right way to set a minimum wage for independent contractors, and to get companies like Uber and Lyft to follow both the spirit and the letter of the rules.
This is sort of a loophole and gray area that the regulator has not included in their rule and allowing this sort of thing to happen.
These rules could be changing soon. New York City regulators have agreed to revisit the driver minimum wage by the end of the year to make sure the system works for all parties, drivers, customers, and companies alike. And what would those new rules be?
The TLC says they're still in deliberation on those rules, but one thing that was clear was that they would limit how many new drivers the companies could onboard. Another thing that they're considering is sort of looking at that utilization rate to see how it actually reflects the driver's experience so that they can be compensated fairly. But drivers who are most impacted in this instance, they may not be able to afford to wait for new rules. A lot of them told us they already considering other jobs to complement income.
In the meantime, after months of lockouts and several driver protests, Uber, Lyft, the mayor's office, and the TLC made a deal. Uber agreed to stop its lockouts, as long as Lyft did more to keep its own utilization rate up. And what's the status of these lockouts now? Are drivers like Mohammed still signing onto the app, looking for the go button, and instead being turned away?
So Uber has stopped lockouts as of early September per the agreement because Lyft is now trying to keep their promise with the utilization rate. So Lyft is still continuing lockouts. So for Mohammed, he's been able to drive for Uber, but he's still locked out by Lyft.
Mohammed says the whole experience has left him exhausted. He used to wake up each morning knowing he'd be able to jump into work as soon as he wanted. Now, it's unpredictable. How and when he drives doesn't feel under his control anymore.
So it's like this is like a monkey business. This is make you depressed. Many days I feel depressed, I go back home.
This is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Thomas Liu. It was edited by Stacey Vanek Smith and Dana Wallman. It was mixed by Alex Sugiura. It was fact-checked by Adriana Tapia. Our senior producer is Naomi Shavin. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Our executive producer is Nicole Beamster-Bohr. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.